All right, great. So let's get into it. So we'll start with some very quick introductions. So Jesse Knutson from Bitfinex Securities, and sorry, let me just check my notes here. Tobias Seidl from Stoker, co-CEO of Stoker, and Tim Aron, who is working as an external lawyer for Bitfinex and Tether, and also head of compliance for Bitfinex Securities. So we're talking about the legal landscape, and let's just start with the question of why. I mean, why tokenize these securities? What are some of the benefits that you see from this?
Oh, can you hear me? Oh, perfect. Yeah, I think there are like several layers why it makes totally sense like to tokenize securities. You know, when you think a little bit about what are securities, securities are basically like a representation of a right, right? When you think about, like, there was a scholar, a French scholar once said, "L'écrit n'est pas le droit, et le constat," which means basically, you know, like the right is not the written, but it's actually what is lying beyond it, right? So the securities and security tokens represent actually the underlying right against like a company or the issuer. And with the tokenization, we give back like the ownership actually to the investors, and also like the control of the investor base to the issuer or the companies of securities. I think these are the main advantages of security tokens, and obviously there is also like another layer is like go-to-market is much easier, you know, because you don't have like to feed like the whole financial system to issue your securities. You can beef on existing layers like Bitfinex Securities or Stoker, you know, and we're working all close together. So it's a pretty simple thing. And then obviously you get also liquidity in the market with secondary markets as Bitfinex Securities is providing. I think these are like the main points why I think it makes sense like to tokenize securities. You know, as an issuer, you have like a direct relationship with the investors, right? So you really manage your investor register, you manage your investor base. So you basically, you're really in charge of who is investing into your company.
Yeah, maybe add a couple points onto that. So I think basically what we're trying to do with tokenized securities, I think, is not that complex. We're basically taking the technology from Bitcoin and the digital asset you know, exchanges and markets that has really kind of matured over the last 10 years and been battle tested, taking that technology and applying it to traditional capital markets. And I think that what that yields is, as Tobias mentioned, it's a system that's more efficient. So our goal is to, you know, disintermediate a lot of the players that kind of evolved over several decades of securities law and create a system where we can have issuers and investors more directly interact with each other. And I can think of, you know, a couple of benefits to add on to what Tobias said is, you know, from the trading perspective, all those benefits that us as, you know, investors in the digital asset space and Bitcoin space are familiar with, 24/7, 365 trading. You know, my financials, my markets experience was in Taiwan, right? So we're 9 till 1:30. We work Monday to Friday. We don't work weekends. You know, market closes at 1:30, we're done. So it's a real benefit to have 24/7, 365 trading. Another thing that gets overlooked, I think, is real-time settlement. So in Taiwan, it's T+2 settlement. Most markets are T+2 settlement. So if you sell your TSMC on Friday, you don't get your cash until Monday, right? So there's a risk management issue on that. There's a capital management issue. If you're a hedge fund, you can churn your funds a lot more if you can get real-time settlement. For issuers, you know, we often talk about banking the unbanked in, you know, Bitcoin and the financial technology space. And I think that also applies to issuers, right? So there's whole parts of the world, different regions, El Salvador, Latin America, Central Asia, that are siloed off from traditional capital markets. Part of that is just because it's not worth the effort of investment banks because it's cost prohibitive. But because we're more efficient, we have a lower cost basis, we can interact with smaller companies, do smaller issuances, and also, you know, operate in places like El Salvador, the AIFC, and in Kazakhstan, Central Asia, and hopefully many other emerging markets as well. And then finally, on the investor side, I would say with technology like Blockstream's Liquid Network, you have a function called transfer restricted assets, so we can create whitelists. Once you have that whitelist created, it opens up a lot of freedom, and it makes a really low kind of friction user experience that as Bitcoin traders and savers and hodlers we're all very familiar with. You can pull your securities off an exchange, you can self-custody them, you could send them to other exchanges for arbitrage, or you could even trade them peer-to-peer on a Telegram chat, or anywhere, because you have that whitelisted ecosystem. So I think it's also a lot about bringing back control to investors that's really been eroded over the last several decades.
I haven't got a huge amount to add to that, other than I think the theme that runs through it is it's a democratizing of the access, and you've democratized the access for the investors, but you also allow actors into the market which ordinarily wouldn't be able to get there. So you see new financial centers opening and being able to put together the infrastructure to allow the trading of securities, which ordinarily wouldn't be able to do that because the technology now provides the possibility for it. I've worked on setting up legacy securities exchanges, and it takes years, and that's not just the legal infrastructure around it, but it's also making sure the technology works. The technology actually provides real opportunities for new financial centers to come through, but also within that, new opportunities to find a wider issuer base and a wider investor base.
So some of the benefits, as you have mentioned, are around accessibility, speed, the ability to self-custody. So one question people might be having on the question of accessibility, there is this element of accredited investor, right? Like the requirements, depending on the country, depending on, it might have a certain net worth requirement or a certain income level requirement. So obviously we're navigating the legal landscape here. How do we sort of marry these worlds of the old rules, accredited investors, and trying to tokenize securities?
Holding the mic, so I'll start. The answer to that is you look to the law of where the exchange is set up. If the exchange is set up and imposes requirements for particular disclosure requirements for particular types of investors, so accredited investors, then you need to make sure those disclosure requirements are made to the investor base there. Obviously, different jurisdictions will have different standards in terms of the disclosure, but the short answer to the question is I think that once you've established the law and understood the law in the jurisdiction where the exchange is set up, that's the answer to the question. Now, whether or not when you see new financial centers coming through, they might step away from the standards which are imposed in, say, for example, the States or Europe, which have particular disclosure requirements for under the prospectus regime or under other legislation. And in that sense, you might see a loosening of the standards of disclosure. But the expectation is likely to be that if you have a tokenized securities exchange or a legacy securities exchange, you would find the same standards of disclosure wherever they are. But I think the interesting aspects come when you have new challenging financial centers who say, hang on a second, is it really appropriate for us to impose this particular standard onto the exchanges, or is it necessary to have prospectuses put out there when we know from our experience that investors actually probably don't read the prospectus anyway, and if it's done through an intermediary, they probably do read them. And then you can start to challenge existing structures. But when you've got somewhere like the EU and it's imposed at a harmonized level across the whole EU, it's very difficult to move away from those particular standards. But I'll hand over to Tobias, who has more experience on this stuff than me.
Yeah, I think adding to what you have said, Tim, I think like the accredited investor is like an American concept, right? So we have like professional investors in euros, semi-professional investors, retail investors, and the like. So it really depends where the investors finally are sitting. So what we do, for example, at Stockers will be our primary issuance platform, right? So you come on the platform, and the issuer can actually decide what kind of investors the instrument is actually issued to, and this is enabled by Liquid, by the registered asset on the Liquid network. Basically, you register your wallet, right? And the issuer can say, okay, what kind of investors I want to have, right? So either like accredited investors, professional investors, or a wide investor base. It's also depending on the geography of the investors. And then you have like a restricted whitelist, and only people who are actually on this whitelist can then receive these tokens and then finally also be able to trade them on a secondary market. So that's how it's actually done, and it's the same thing as a normal capital market. So the tokenization element gives here an additional layer of control, I would say.
Sorry, just had just thinking about that. So in the AIFC, where Bitfinex Securities is set up, they have the concept of accredited investors, which is basically high net worth individuals who can trade in tranches of 100K, or authorized firms or corporates. That's the accredited investor standard. Within the AIFC as well, we've now got a dispensation from that, where we can include in the accredited investor bracket entities that we assess as professional clients, which would demonstrate a particular level of competency in terms of trading, as well as a certain amount of assets. We can put them into the accredited investor category in the AIFC. The regulators approved us to do that. The advantage of that is if you are doing an accredited investor offering, you can do it without a prospectus. So in a sense, that's an example of the point I was trying to make around new financial centers potentially give greater leniency to some of these things where you wouldn't necessarily find those standards in established jurisdictions.
Yeah. And so just so I'm understanding you there, part of that might be that, if you think about the big public markets of the world today, they have these very high compliance costs, and they have, as you said, all these disclosure requirements. And so I guess what I'm reading from you there is that with some newer jurisdictions, they may have a lower level of requirements, and this may provide some kind of business and product opportunity when it comes to tokenizing securities?
I don't know if it's necessarily lower level of requirements. I think it's a different approach. So if you look at what fundamentally is the reason for these accredited investor rules, and I think it's basically trying to come up with a quick and dirty proxy for understanding and for ability to take pain, right? So they want to find people that can be comfortable with risk, they can evaluate it, and if everything goes wrong, that they're going to be in a position where it's not going to wipe them out, right? So I think that's kind of the idea between having these dollars limits set on accredited investors. I think with the new technology that's coming out in everything from technology and growth stocks or whatever in normal markets or in digital assets, in a lot of cases it's younger people who are probably better able to evaluate this technology, but ironically they haven't had the time to accumulate wealth and maybe not be able to meet traditional accredited investor definitions. So I think Tim's point was a really good one. The way that securities kind of ecosystems have emerged over the last 50 or 100 years, there's a lot of intermediaries in between. So there's a lot of pushback from people that maybe our technology can disintermediate. As I said at the beginning, our goal is to put issuers, investors, and more directly in contact. And there's an opportunity in these smaller, kind of more peripheral markets that are, smaller economies, places like the AIFC in Kazakhstan or in El Salvador, to kind of relook at this stuff and start from scratch without all the pushback from those massive intermediaries. And if you look at, Kazakhstan, maybe financial services are 2% of GDP. Maybe it's even smaller in El Salvador. So there's better risk reward for them. There's more upside for them to try new things. And I think, this is a question that I have, is where is the innovation going to come within the security token space? Where is this really going to kind of take hold and create new capital markets? Is it going to be in the legacy G7 markets? Or is it going to be in El Salvador, emerging markets, places like the AIFC? And I think Bitfinex Securities, and probably Bitfinex more broadly, our bet is on some of these smaller, more nimble jurisdictions.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. And so when it comes to, I guess, aspects of centralized control and marrying that with this world of Bitcoin and Liquid and other technologies that are part of this colloquial, part of this stack, how do you deal with that? So as an example, if there's fraud or theft, or the investor, let's say we're talking about not your keys, not your coins, what if they lose their keys? How do you sort of thread that needle of having enough centralized control that you can deal with things like that, but also let users hold their own keys?
Yeah, here I think the technology comes really in. With the restricted assets, for example, on Liquid, which is a sidechain of Bitcoin, you can first thing 24/7 who are the investors, right? In case there's like a fraud, you can definitely identify every time like the investor, right? And the good thing about this, I think, and it's a very important point, when it comes like to security tokens, right? Because when you have like a peer-to-peer transfer of a security token, and there is like a problem in the change of transaction before, right? You want to make sure that you still have actually the right, even if you got the security token from a fraudulent person. This is we call like the negotiability element, which is like also like embedded like in old times, like with paper certificates and the like, right? And this is now again the truth actually of the ownership is laying actually then with the token, right? Independent of whether there has been a fraud. To answer your question, what happens actually when you lose your keys? You have like a recovery function, right? As how it is working in the end, you know, like for example, like the vehicles which are issuing the securities, for example, for our structures in Luxembourg, they hold their own investor register, and this investor register is actually updated by transactions on the blockchain. So as soon as you have like a token is transferred, I transferred the token to you, you are actually entered into the investor register, right? And in this moment of time, we know, you know exactly who is there, and you have like actually this specific claim. And when you lose your key, we know, okay, you had actually this kind of tokens, and then we can actually reissue the asset again. So it's a different concept as with Bitcoin.
Not quite on the same point, but I think one of the issues around centralization, which is important to keep in mind with securities, is that you have an ongoing relationship as a purchaser of the securities with the issuer, and that's reflected mainly through the ongoing transparency and disclosure requirements that exist in the legacy capital markets. So to the extent that there's inside information that needs to be provided to the market in a way that ensures that no particular market players can take advantage of it, then the infrastructure is all built out there. I think one of the aspects that will need to be worked through as we move more and more into the tokenization of securities space is that in the legacy markets, issuers very often work with sponsor investment banks who will make sure they understand their obligations to disclose to the market. And to the extent you have issuers without those close relationships with investment banks, you do have some degree of additional risk in this space. And I think picking up on Jesse's point, it is an amazing technology that does allow that relationship between the issuer and the holder of the securities to be that bit closer. But there is often a reason why you do have the intermediaries there. So I think that there is still a role for those intermediaries to a degree. It may well be that some of the activities get pared back, or they may not be entirely appropriate in all the space, but protection of investors often does come from understanding for the issuers to understand what they need to disclose to the market and when. And that's why I think it would be very difficult to move to a properly decentralized securities environment, or one of the reasons.
The other thing I would add is that I think security tokens, by definition, have to be at least somewhat centralized, right? Because the companies are doing the issuances, so the companies are known. I don't think this can be, properly decentralized, and they have obligations as well to know who's on their registry, who their owners are. We have, regulators, so I think it's basically, centralized, but with some decentralized characteristics. So you're trying to meet your KYC, AML regulatory obligations, while at the same time giving a low friction experience to users.
Okay, I see, yeah. One other question is the question of existing securities. So what happens to existing securities? Is there going to be some kind of cross-listing system where you might have some that are in, a liquid context and some that are on, a TradFi centralized system? How does that work?
Yeah, I think this is massively interesting. So actually, a few months ago, we signed an MOU with a conventional securities exchange in Astana, one of the jurisdictions where we're registered, the Astana International Exchange, and we're working with them to develop dual listing. So there's companies that want to do IPOs, and they want to do both a tokenized version and a conventional version, and then to develop a conversion mechanism to switch between those. So I think that's massively interesting. And if you think about it, that's kind of what you're trying to do with depository receipts. And that's a very well-beaten path. So if you have a company like TSMC, it wants to get access to American investors. They issue an ADR in the US. STOs are essentially the same thing, trying to get access to global liquidity. And I think we can do that a lot more efficiently.
Sorry, just if you could explain, what's ADR and STO, just for the audience?
Well, STO is a security token. I would hope everyone here knows
So
that.
sorry.
And ADR is an American depository receipt, and there's GDRs, global depository receipts. It's basically just when you take shares of a company and then you issue it in another market. So Taiwan trades, Asian hours, 9 to 1:30. If you want to have European investors, and maybe you need to take those shares and issue them in Luxembourg. And there's no reason, I think, why a jurisdiction like the AIFC or El Salvador can't be one of these jurisdictions where people go to do STOs with the exact same idea of opening up access to some of these already listed companies to global investors. So I think, over time, I think the market will move towards tokenized securities. That used to be a crazy view, right? But I think more and more that's becoming the consensus view. And we're seeing more people who are huge in finance, people like Larry Fink of BlackRock. They're coming around. More of these big traditional players are doing it. So I think, interestingly, increasingly, that's becoming a consensus view. And I think over time, we'll see tokenized securities completely replace conventional securities. But in the meantime, we'll have both of them existing at the same time. And interesting, probably to the benefit of both, right? So if you have tokenized securities that trade 24/7, 365 globally, and then you've got conventional securities that trade, whatever market hours are, 9 till 1:30, and have different investors. Maybe on the conventional securities, it's more mainstream institutional investors. On tokenized, it's more crypto high net worth. So you get different investors with different investment appetites. And I think just naturally, there'll be arbitrage opportunities there that will drive volume on both platforms.
Yeah, absolutely, and I totally agree with you, Chess. Yeah, I think it's also more like an evolution, right? So we have a new technology, and this technology is, I think, superior to the system we have currently with so many different intermediaries. You're relying on brokers because, for example, when you have an Apple share, for example, right, you have just like a claim against your bank. And then the bank has a claim against another broker, and then I have a claim against the central securities depository, and so many intermediaries in between, and Apple does even not know that you are holding the shares. So I think this is like a superior technology, but obviously it will take time because you disintermediate a lot of players in the financial markets. And that's obviously is something where a lot of resistance is coming from. But I think we have now the technology to do it, and tokenization of securities will be definitely the future, and it will come as totally unavoidable, I think, because the technology is superior to what was currently in place.
I totally agree with that. I think you've got very established financial centers with a huge amount of connections between the various actors, and also, in a sense, regulators who have their bread and butter by regulating a whole stream of different actors. I mean, when you look at the infrastructure around a traditional exchange or a traditional derivatives exchange, it's massive. And when you see the ability to have instantaneous settlement with this technology, you remove immediately from that infrastructure a number of key players, and they are, of course, going to fight tooth and nail to continue to have a role. And I think it's very, very similar in terms of the technology around keeping records of who has ownership. You've got CSDs in the centralized securities depositories in the established space, and what's their role in the new market? I think that there will be a very long transition period, not just because of the huge amounts of legacy securities out there, but gradually I think that the actors will start to adopt the technology, and then the interesting place to watch will be those entities who are first adopters of tokenized securities will be going almost in a sense competitively head-to-head with the legacy actors as they adopt the technology. The new adopters will have the advantage in the sense of being the first to move there. They'll have a significant client base who's very supportive of the technology, but the legacy actors will have a huge established client base, and seeing how that maps out and how those two, it may well be there's a degree of takeovers, etc. But seeing how that maps out, it's going to probably be over the next 5 or 10 years before we actually end up with a move towards fully moving towards the full technology.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because you're going to get there's an opportunity here for places like El Salvador and the AIFC to compete asymmetrically with major financial centers. And you may get a situation where the G7 is very slow to adopt this technology, and the AIFC and El Salvador are very quick. So it could be very interesting in terms how financial centers develop. I mean, Singapore 50 years ago, probably nobody would have thought, or Hong Kong, nobody would have thought it would become a major financial center, and they are. So there's an opportunity for El Salvador and the AIFC and regimes like this that I think is really exciting. Yeah, I'd also like to make a pre-announcement.
Announcing the announcement. Let's do it.
I'm going to announce an announcement. So tomorrow, during the Bitfinex Securities panel, we'll be announcing our new issuance, which I think is very exciting. It's a 36-month bond issued by a microfinancing company with a 10% coupon, and they'll be raising in Tether. So I think this is one of the first properly tokenized bonds in the market. People can, it'll be issued on the Liquid network. You can pull it off the platform. You can self-custody it. You can trade it peer-to-peer. So I think this is a very exciting way for investors in the digital asset space to get access to yield in a way that's not quite as extreme on the risk profile.
Great. Well, that's all we have time for. So, put your hands together.